The stallion's eyes burned like embers in the pre-dawn darkness, wild and unforgiving as he reared against the rope that bound him to the weathered fence post. Blood matted his midnight coat where the leather had cut deep, and his screams split. The morning air like thunder, a sound that made even the bravest ranch hands step back in fear. Maverick Thornfield wiped the sweat from his brow, his expensive boots already caked with mud from the corral. He'd paid more for this horse than most people saw in a lifetime, lured by tales of the stallion's legendary speed and strength. What he'd gotten instead was a beast that seemed possessed by demons, untouchable and unbreakable despite weeks of the most brutal training methods money could buy. "Sir, maybe we should consider," began his head trainer, but Maverick silenced him with a sharp gesture. "I don't pay you to think, Garrett. I pay you to break horses." His voice carried the cold authority of a man accustomed to bending the world to his will. "This animal will submit, or it will be destroyed." Beyond the manicured grounds of the Thornfield estate, where the perfectly trimmed hedges gave way to rolling farmland, 17-year-old Juniper Blackthorn pressed her face against the cracked window of her family's rundown farmhouse. The horse's cries had been echoing across the valley for days now, and each tortured sound sent shivers down her spine. Her father, Cornelius, looked up from the kitchen table where he sat surrounded by overdue bills and foreclosure notices. His weathered hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, hands that had once been strong enough to work the land, but now shook from exhaustion and worry. "That poor creature," Juniper whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Why won't they just leave him be?" Cornelius followed her gaze toward the distant estate. "Rich folks don't understand some things can't be bought or broken, little bird. They think everything has a price." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Their own small farm was failing, crushed under the weight of medical bills from her mother's long illness and the subsequent funeral costs. The bank notices piling up on the table were proof that even their modest piece of land might soon belong to someone like Maverick Thornfield. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the stallion's struggles grew more desperate. Juniper could see the tiny figures of men in the distance, circling the corral like vultures. She'd heard whispers in town about the horse, how it had been captured wild from the mountains, how it had injured 3 trainers already, how Thornfield was considering having it put down if it couldn't be tamed by week's end. Something deep in her chest ached at the thought. She'd always felt a kinship with wild things, perhaps because she understood what it meant to be cornered, to have your back against the wall with nowhere left to run. Her family was facing their own kind of breaking, their own desperate fight for survival. "Pa," she said softly, not turning from the window. "What if someone could help that horse? What if there was another way?" Cornelius set down his cup with a heavy sigh. "The world's full of what-ifs, Juniper. But Thornfield's got more money than sense, and men like him don't listen to people like us." But as Juniper watched the distant drama unfold, her mind began to turn over possibilities. She'd grown up around animals, had always possessed an inexplicable ability to calm even the wildest creatures, and lately, with everything falling apart around them, she'd been desperate to find some way, any way, to save what remained of their family's legacy. The horse's next cry seemed to call directly to her soul, and she made a decision that would change everything. The opportunity came 3 days later when Juniper overheard Mrs. Weatherby gossiping at the general store about Thornfield's mounting frustration. The wealthy rancher had apparently issued an ultimatum. Anyone who could tame the beast would receive a reward of $10,000, enough to pay off her family's debts 3 times over. "Course, he's just showboating," Mrs. Weatherby continued, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles. "Knows full well, ain't nobody in these parts fool enough to try. That demon horse has already sent 2 men to the hospital." Juniper's heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched her meager grocery list. $10,000. The number echoed, in her mind like a prayer and a curse combined. It was impossible, of course, a pipe dream born of desperation. But as she walked home past the Thornfield estate, she couldn't help but stop and stare across the fields. The stallion stood motionless in the center of the corral now, his magnificent head held high despite the cuts and welts that marked his body. Even from a distance, she could see the defiance blazing in his dark eyes, the proud arch of his neck that spoke of noble bloodlines and untamed spirit. "You're not broken, are you, beautiful?" she whispered into the wind. "You're just waiting for someone to speak your language." That evening, as her father dozed fitfully in his chair by the dying fire, Juniper made her way to the old trunk in her mother's former sewing room. Beneath layers of faded quilts and yellowed photographs, she found what she was looking for. Her mother's journal, filled with observations about the animals that had wandered onto their property over the years. Lydia, Blackthorn had possessed a gift that bordered on the supernatural. Injured deer would seek her out, wild birds would perch on her shoulders, and even the most aggressive farm animals would calm under her touch. She'd tried to teach Juniper her methods, but the lessons had been cut short by illness and death. Now, reading her mother's careful notes by candlelight, Juniper began to understand the deeper patterns her mother had discovered. It wasn't magic. It was observation, patience, and an almost musical understanding of how fear and trust worked in the animal kingdom. "Fear makes them fight," her mother had written in her careful script. But beneath every show of aggression lies a creature that simply wants to be understood. The key is never to meet force with force, but to become a safe harbor in their storm. The next morning, Juniper rose before dawn and walked the 2 miles to the Thornfield estate. Her hands shook as she approached the ornate iron gates, but she forced herself to press the buzzer. When Maverick Thornfield himself answered the door, clearly having been roused from sleep, his expression shifted from annoyance to puzzlement as he took in the slight figure standing on his doorstep. "What do you want, girl?" His voice carried the same cold authority she'd heard from across the fields. Juniper lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I want to try with your horse, sir. I heard about your offer." Thornfield's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You? A slip of a thing like you?" He looked her up and down, taking in her patched dress and worn boots. "That animal would kill you before you got within 10 feet of him." "Maybe," Juniper said quietly. "But I'd like the chance to try. What have you got to lose? You're planning to destroy him anyway if no one can reach him." Something in her tone made Thornfield pause. Perhaps it was the quiet desperation beneath. Her words, or the way she held herself with dignity despite her obvious poverty, or perhaps it was simply that he'd exhausted all other options. "Fine," he said finally. "But when that beast tramples you into the dirt, don't come crying to me. You'll sign a waiver first, releasing me from all liability." As he turned to fetch the papers, Juniper felt her knees nearly buckle with relief and terror combined. She was really going to do this, risk everything on her mother's teachings and her own untested instincts. But as the sun climbed higher and she found herself standing at the edge of the corral, staring into the wild eyes of the most dangerous animal she'd ever encountered, one thought rang clear in her mind. Sometimes the greatest gambles were the only ones worth taking. The stallion's muscles bunched like coiled springs as Juniper approached the corral fence. Every line of his body screamed danger. Ears pinned back, nostrils flared, hooves pawing the earth in warning. The assembled crowd of ranch hands and curious neighbors had grown throughout the morning, drawn by word of the foolish farm girl, who thought she could accomplish what seasoned professionals had failed to do. "This is madness," muttered Garrett, Thornfield's head trainer. "That beast will kill her the moment she steps foot in there." But Juniper barely heard the murmurs of the crowd. Her attention was focused entirely on the horse, studying the subtle language of his posture and movement. Her mother's journal had been specific about reading the signs. The tilt of the ears, the tension in the neck, the way a truly wild animal carried its tail. What she saw surprised her. Beneath the obvious aggression, she recognized something else entirely. Bone-deep exhaustion. This magnificent creature had been fighting for weeks, using every ounce of his strength to resist capture and training. He was running on fumes now, driven by pure stubbornness and the primal need to remain free. "He's not angry," she whispered to herself, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He's terrified." Ignoring the protests from the crowd, Juniper climbed over the fence and dropped silently into the corral. The stallion's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared up, front hooves slashing the air just feet from where she stood. But instead of backing away, Juniper did something completely unexpected. She sat down. Right there in the dirt, cross-legged like a child at story time, she simply sat and waited. The horse landed heavily, snorting and pawing, clearly confused by this strange human behavior. He'd been expecting her to advance with ropes and whips like all the others. Instead, she'd made herself smaller, less threatening. "Easy, beautiful," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you." For several long minutes, they remained frozen in tableau. The wild stallion poised for flight or fight, the slight girl sitting peacefully in the dust. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable charge that would end this foolish experiment in tragedy. But Juniper had learned patience from years of helping her mother with injured wildlife. She understood that healing, whether of body or spirit, happened on nature's timeline, not human convenience. So she sat, and she waited, occasionally humming soft melodies her mother used to sing while tending to frightened animals. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stallion's posture began to change. His ears flicked forward for brief moments before pinning back again. His breathing deepened. The constant pawing and head-tossing gradually stilled. "That's right," Juniper whispered, still not moving from her spot. "You're tired, aren't you? Tired of fighting? Tired of being afraid? I know that feeling." She began to speak then, not loud enough for the crowd to hear, but in a gentle stream of consciousness that seemed to flow directly from her heart to his ears. She told him about her mother's death, about the crushing weight of medical bills and foreclosure notices. She spoke of loneliness and fear, of feeling trapped with no way out. "They want to break you," she said softly. "The same way life tried to break my family. But broken doesn't have to mean destroyed, does it? Sometimes broken things can be put back together stronger than before." The stallion took a tentative step closer, then stopped, every muscle still coiled for instant retreat. But his eyes, those magnificent dark eyes, had lost some of their wild edge. In them, Juniper saw recognition. Not of her specifically, but of something familiar. The soul-deep weariness of a creature pushed beyond its limits. "I see you," she whispered, and for the first time since entering the corral, she slowly extended one hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. "You don't have to trust me yet, but I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." The crowd had fallen silent now, sensing that something extraordinary was happening in the dusty corral. Even Maverick Thornfield found himself leaning forward, his businessman's skepticism warring with growing amazement. The stallion stretched his neck toward her outstretched hand, not quite close enough to touch, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her palm. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then, as if making a monumental decision, the great horse took one more step forward and allowed his muzzle to brush against her fingertips. The first gentle contact he'd permitted with any human since his capture. The touch lasted only seconds before he jerked back, but it was enough. In that brief moment of connection, Juniper felt something pass between them, an understanding deeper than words, a recognition of shared pain and the possibility of healing. The real work was just beginning. Over the following days, Juniper established a routine that puzzled everyone watching from the sidelines. Each morning at dawn, she would arrive at the estate and spend hours simply sitting in the corral with the stallion. No ropes, no halters, no attempts at traditional training methods, just patient presence and quiet conversation. Maverick Thornfield found himself increasingly intrigued by the girl's unconventional approach. Against his better judgment, he'd allowed her to continue after that first breakthrough moment, partly out of curiosity and partly because his expensive trainers had completely failed where this farm girl was showing progress. "What exactly is she doing out there?" he asked Garrett one morning as they watched Juniper from the porch of the main house. The head trainer shook his head, clearly baffled. "Damned if I know, sir. She just talks to him. Been bringing him apples and carrots, too, though he won't take them from her hand yet, leaves them on the ground and backs away." What neither man could see was the delicate dance of trust being performed in the corral. Juniper had studied her mother's journals extensively, learning about the patience required to reach traumatized animals. Every day she pushed the boundaries, just a little further. First, the stallion had learned to tolerate her presence without constant vigilance. Then gradually, he'd begun to show interest in the treats she brought, eventually approaching them while she sat nearby. Now, after nearly a week, she was able to stand and move slowly around the corral while he watched with alert but no longer panicked attention. "You're starting to remember, aren't you?" she said softly as she brushed dust from a fence post. "Remember what it was like before the fear took over, before humans became something to fight instead of something to, well, maybe not trust yet, but at least coexist with." The stallion followed her movements with his dark eyes, his body language more relaxed than it had been since his capture. The angry wounds on his coat were beginning to heal, and some of the haunted desperation had faded from his expression. But Juniper knew the real test was still ahead. Physical proximity was one thing, actual touch was another entirely. For 3 more days, she worked on gradually decreasing the distance between them during their sessions. She would extend her hand, let him investigate her scent, then slowly reach toward his neck before pulling back when she sensed his tension rising. "I know it's scary," she murmured during one particularly challenging session. "Humans have hurt. You, haven't they? Used their hands for pain instead of comfort. But not all hands are the same, beautiful. Some hands are meant for healing." The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when unexpected rain began falling halfway through their session. Instead of seeking shelter, Juniper remained in the corral, letting the water soak through her thin jacket. The stallion, equally unbothered by the weather, seemed to sense something different about this moment. Perhaps it was the way the rain washed away the last traces of human scent that might have alarmed him, or the primal connection that water represented, washing clean, starting fresh. Whatever the reason, when Juniper slowly reached out her hand this time, the stallion didn't pull away. Her fingers made contact with his rain-dampened neck, and for the first time since his capture, the great horse stood completely still under human touch, not frozen with fear, but genuinely calm, allowing this small gesture of connection. "There you are," Juniper whispered, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. "I knew you were still in there somewhere." From the shelter of the barn, Maverick Thornfield watched in amazement as his impossible horse submitted to the gentle stroking of a 17-year-old farm girl. For the first time in weeks, the stallion's head hung relaxed, his eyes half closed in what could only be described as contentment. "Well, I'll be damned," Garrett muttered beside him. "In all my years of training horses, I've never seen anything like that." Thornfield said nothing, but his mind was racing. He'd built his fortune on recognizing value and potential, and what he was witnessing in that rain-soaked corral was something far more valuable than a broken horse finally submitting to human will. This was genuine partnership being born, the kind of bond between human and animal that money couldn't buy and force couldn't create. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he found himself wondering if perhaps there were other ways to measure success than simple dominance and control. Word of the farm girl's success with the untamable stallion spread through the county like wildfire. Curious visitors began arriving at the Thornfield estate, hoping to witness the miracle for themselves. Some came with genuine interest in her methods, while others arrived with skepticism, convinced that reports of her progress were greatly exaggerated. Juniper tried to ignore the growing audience as she continued her daily sessions with the horse. Trust, she'd learned from her mother's writings, was a fragile thing that could be shattered by outside pressure or attempts to rush the process. The stallion was making remarkable progress, but she knew that one careless moment could undo weeks of careful work. By the second week, she was able to touch him freely, running her hands along his neck and shoulders while he stood in relaxed acceptance. The angry wounds from his captivity had healed, revealing the magnificent copper-black coat that had been hidden beneath the scabs and matted hair. His eyes, once wild with rage and fear, now watched her with what could only be described as affection. "You're beautiful, you know that?" she told him one morning as she gently worked tangles from his mane with her fingers. "Not just on the outside, though you certainly are that. Beautiful in here, too." She placed her palm over his heart, feeling the strong, steady rhythm beneath her hand. The stallion lowered his great head until his forehead rested against her shoulder, a gesture of complete trust that made her breath catch in her throat. In that moment, she felt a connection deeper than anything she'd ever experienced, as if their souls had recognized each other across the vast divide between species. But their peaceful routine was interrupted one morning by the arrival of a sleek black sedan bearing license plates from the state capitol. From it emerged a stern-faced woman in an expensive suit, followed by two men with official badges and clipboards. Dr. Viridian Ashworth from the State Agricultural Commission had come to investigate reports of inhumane treatment and unlawful restraint of wild animals. She strode across the ranch yard with the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding authority, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the operation. "Mr. Thornfield," she announced without preamble, "I'm here regarding complaints filed about your treatment of a wild stallion captured from protected mountain territory. My preliminary investigation suggests this animal was taken illegally and has been subjected to abusive training methods." Maverick's face darkened. "That horse was purchased legally through proper channels. I have all the documentation." "Documentation that appears to have been falsified." Dr. Ashworth cut him off coldly. "This stallion bears DNA markers consistent with the Thunder Ridge wild herd, which has been under federal protection for the past 3 years. If my suspicions are correct, someone is going to face serious criminal charges." Juniper felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. If the horse was seized by federal authorities, she would never see him again. Worse, he would likely be relocated to a government facility where her patient work would be undone by well-meaning but impersonal handlers. "Please," she said, stepping forward despite her fear of the intimidating official. "Whatever he did wrong, it's not the horse's fault. He's been through enough trauma already." Dr. Ashworth's sharp gaze shifted to Juniper, taking in her mud-stained clothes and work-worn hands. "And you are?" "Juniper Blackthorn. I've been working with him." "Ah, yes, the famous horse whisperer." The woman's tone was skeptical. "I've heard some rather fantastical stories about your methods. Tell me, Miss Blackthorn, do you have any formal training in animal psychology or equine behavior?" "No, ma'am, but then you have no business interfering with a wild animal's natural behaviors. What you call taming could be interpreted as additional psychological trauma layered on top of his capture stress." Before Juniper could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the corral. The stallion, sensing tension and the presence of strangers, had begun pacing restlessly, his calls echoing across the ranch with increasing urgency. "He's calling for me," Juniper said, her heart breaking at the distress in those familiar sounds. "Please, just let me calm him down before—" "Absolutely not," Dr. Ashworth snapped. "No one is to approach that animal until my team has completed its assessment. Guards, see that this area is secured. As uniformed officers began stringing yellow tape around the corral, the stallion's agitation intensified. He reared and struck at the fence, his hard-won peace shattered by the chaos surrounding him. Each desperate call seemed to tear a piece from Juniper's soul. But the guards blocked her path whenever she tried to approach. "You're undoing everything," she pleaded with Dr. Ashworth. "Months of progress gone. Can't you see you're terrifying him?" But the official had already turned away, speaking in low tones with her assistants about transport schedules and holding facilities. In her mind, this was a simple matter of wildlife protection and regulatory compliance. She couldn't see what. Juniper saw a magnificent creature whose spirit was being crushed all over again by human authority and indifference. As the sun set that evening, Juniper sat on her family's porch, listening to the stallion's distant cries carrying on the wind. Tomorrow they would take him away, and all her work, all their connection, would be reduced to nothing more than a footnote in an official report, unless she did something desperate to save them both. The plan came to Juniper in the dark hours. Before dawn, born of desperation and the absolute certainty that she couldn't let them take him away. Her mother's journal had contained more than just animal training notes. It also held detailed maps of the mountain trails her parents had explored in their younger days, including paths that led deep into the protected wilderness where the wild herds still ran free. If the stallion truly belonged to the Thunder Ridge herd, then perhaps that's where he needed to return. Moving with the quiet stealth she'd learned from years of early morning farm chores, Juniper slipped out of the house and made her way across the fields to the Thornfield estate. The federal agents had left for the night, confident that their yellow tape and official warnings would keep everyone away from the corralled stallion. They hadn't counted on a desperate 17-year-old girl who had nothing left to lose. The lock on the corral gate was substantial, but Juniper had come prepared with wire cutters borrowed from her father's tool shed. Her hands shook as she worked, knowing that what she was doing could land her in serious legal trouble. But the alternative, watching the stallion waste away in some government facility, was unthinkable. The moment the gate swung open, the stallion's demeanor changed completely. He approached her without hesitation, pressing his forehead against her chest, in the gesture that had become their special greeting. In the moonlight, his dark eyes seemed to hold a question. "Are we really doing this?" "I don't know if this is right," she whispered, running her hands along his neck one last time. "But I know what's wrong, and I can't let them cage you again." She'd brought neither saddle nor bridle, nothing that would mark him as owned or tamed, if he were discovered in the wild. Instead, she'd braided a simple rope halter that could be easily removed, more of a communication tool than a restraint. The stallion stood perfectly still as she slipped it over his head, then knelt beside him, in the universal invitation to mount. Without hesitation, he lowered himself until she could swing her leg over his broad back. The sensation of sitting astride him was nothing like the farm horses she'd ridden as a child. This was pure power contained beneath her, muscles that could carry them both to freedom if they moved quickly enough. She wound her fingers through his mane and leaned forward to whisper in his ear, "Take us home, beautiful. Take us both home." They moved through the night like ghosts, following game trails and creek beds that wouldn't hold hoof prints. The stallion seemed to know where they were going, his step growing more confident as they climbed higher into the mountains. Several times Juniper thought she heard other horses calling in the distance, and the stallion would pause to answer, his voice carrying a joy she'd never heard before. As dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a hidden valley where dozens of wild horses grazed in peaceful freedom. The Thunder Ridge herd, magnificent, untouchable, and exactly where they belonged. The stallion's entire body trembled with excitement as he called out to his family. Several horses looked up, and one, a gray mare with intelligent eyes, began galloping toward them. The reunion was electric, full of wickering calls and gentle nuzzling that spoke of bonds deeper than human understanding. Juniper slipped from the stallion's back, knowing their time together was ending. He turned to look at her one last time, and in his eyes she saw gratitude mixed with something that might have been love. "Be free," she whispered, removing the rope halter and letting it fall to the ground. "Be wild and beautiful and free." The stallion touched his muzzle to her forehead in farewell, then wheeled and galloped toward his herd. Juniper watched until he disappeared among them, just another wild horse where he belonged. She was arrested, of course, when she returned to face the consequences of her actions. The federal charges were serious: interfering with a government investigation, destruction of property, theft of evidence. Her father mortgaged what little remained of their farm to pay for a lawyer, but everyone expected the worst. The trial became a media sensation. Animal rights groups hailed Juniper as a hero, while government prosecutors painted her as a dangerous criminal who'd interfered with wildlife protection efforts. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in between. But on the day of her sentencing, something unexpected happened. Dr. Ashworth, the stern federal official who'd initiated the seizure, stood up in the courtroom with new evidence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "recent DNA analysis has confirmed that the stallion in question was indeed illegally captured from the Thunder Ridge herd. More importantly, our tracking collars have shown that since his return, he has successfully reintegrated with his family group and is exhibiting completely normal wild behaviors." She paused, looking directly at Juniper. Miss Blackthorn's actions, while technically illegal, resulted in the proper resolution of a case that our official channels had failed to address. The animal is now where he belongs, and our investigation has uncovered the illegal trafficking ring responsible for his capture. The judge, a thoughtful woman who'd been following the case closely, sentenced Juniper to community service working with a local animal rescue organization. "Sometimes," she said from the bench, "the spirit of the law is more important than its letter. Miss Blackthorn, your methods were unorthodox and legally questionable, but your instincts were absolutely correct." 6 months later, Juniper stood on the same mountain ridge where she'd said goodbye to the stallion. Below in the valley, she could see him running with his herd, magnificent and free. Her community service had led to a scholarship for veterinary school, and the book she'd written about their experience had earned enough to save her family's farm. But more than that, she'd learned something about the price of freedom. That sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes doing the right thing means breaking all the rules. In the distance, as if sensing her presence, the stallion paused in his grazing and looked up toward the ridge. For a moment, that seemed to last. Forever their eyes met across the valley. Then he tossed his head and galloped away, wild and beautiful and exactly where he belonged. Some bonds, Juniper realized, are stronger than captivity, deeper than ownership, and more lasting than any human institution. Some connections transcend the boundaries between species, between wild and tame, between freedom and love. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the chance to choose their own path, even if it leads them away from you forever.